On the morning of January 15th, 1947, a young mother named Betty Bersinger was pushing her daughter in a stroller through a quiet Los Angeles neighborhood. She noticed something white in a vacant lot. At first, she thought it was a mannequin, discarded, broken, and thrown in the weeds. The skin was too pale to be real. Then she got closer. It was a woman's body, naked, cut cleanly in half at the waist. Two pieces were positioned about a foot apart, arranged deliberately. Her arms were raised above her head and her legs were spread apart. She was not dumped, but staged. Like a grotesque sculpture placed just a few feet from the sidewalk for anyone walking by to find, there was no blood anywhere. The body had been completely drained, washed clean, and posed with surgical precision. Betty ran to the nearest house and called the police. Within hours, every newspaper in Los Angeles would be screaming about the most brutal murder the city had ever seen. The victim was 22 years old. Her name was Elizabeth Short. She came from Massachusetts with dreams of being in the movies. The newspapers gave her a new name, one that would make her more famous in death than she ever was in life. They called her the Black Dahlia. Her killer was never found. Not in 1947, not in the decades since, and not now, almost 80 years later. This remains one of the largest investigations in Los Angeles history, despite hundreds of suspects and dozens of confessions. But this isn't just a story about an unsolved murder. It's about a city that manufactured dreams while hiding nightmares. It's about what happens when we turn victims into myths. And it's about a young woman who deserved to be remembered more than a headline. Before we descend into this story, I want to ask you something. If you believe the darkest chapters of history deserve to be remembered, and that understanding how ordinary places become crime scenes matters, you can help us by liking the video and subscribing to Late Mysteries. Your support keeps the candle lit. Now, let's meet Elizabeth. Welcome to Late Mysteries. Part 1. The City of Broken Dreams. Before we can understand what happened to Elizabeth Short, we need to understand the city that consumed her. Because Los Angeles in 1947 wasn't just a place, it was a promise, a lie dressed up as an opportunity. It was a dream factory that ran on broken hearts and buried its failures in unmarked graves. No one who came there chasing fame left unchanged, most left destroyed. Picture Los Angeles in the winter of 1947. The war is over. The boys have come home, those who survived anyway. America is supposed to be celebrating, basking in the glow of victory, and building the future that everyone fought for. But something is wrong, something nobody wants to talk about. The soldiers who returned from Europe and the Pacific weren't the same boys who left. They'd seen things that couldn't be unseen. The beaches of Normandy carpeted with bodies, the liberation of concentration camps, and the atomic shadows burned into the walls of Hiroshima. They came back to a country that wanted them to forget and move on, but some of them couldn't. The suicide rate among veterans spiked, and alcoholism became an epidemic. In 1947, they called it shell shock or combat fatigue, and they expected men to get over it without help. Los Angeles drew these broken men like moths to a flame. The city promised reinvention, that your past didn't matter, and the California sun would bleach away whatever darkness you carried. But the city lied. In 1947, Los Angeles was growing faster than any metropolis in American history. People came for the movie industry, which had never been more powerful. In 1946, tens of millions of Americans sat in darkened theaters and watched beautiful people live beautiful lives. They believed that somewhere in California, that life was waiting for them. Elizabeth Short believed it too. So did thousands of other young women who flooded into Los Angeles every year, but most never got an audition. They became waitresses and telephone operators if they were lucky. If they weren't lucky, they became part of the city's dark economy. Prostitution was rampant, controlled by madams like Brenda Allen, whose operation was protected by the Los Angeles Police Department. The LAPD in 1947 was corrupt to its core, with officers on the take from gamblers and pimps. This was the city that manufactured dreams for the world while running on exploitation and violence. This was the reality behind the orange groves and the swimming pools of the Hollywood Hills. This was where Elizabeth Short arrived in 1946, carrying a suitcase full of dreams and no idea what she was walking into. Part 2. Before she became the Black Dahlia, she was someone's daughter and someone's sister. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29, 1924, in Boston, Massachusetts. She was the third of 5 daughters born to Cleo Short Jr. and Phoebe May Sawyer. Her father was a builder of miniature golf courses, a booming business until the stock market crash of 1929. Following the collapse of his business, Cleo Short disappeared in 1930. His car was found abandoned, and the police assumed suicide. Phoebe Short became a widow at 33 with 5 daughters to support. Except Cleo Short wasn't dead. He had abandoned his family to start over where his failures couldn't follow him. Elizabeth was 6 years old when her father disappeared. She grew up in a household shaped by struggle and her mother's exhausted determination. Elizabeth developed a love for movies early on, finding escape in theaters where dreams came true. In 1942, she received a letter revealing her father was alive and living in Vallejo, California. He invited her to come west, and she went, perhaps hoping for reconciliation or escape. What she found was disappointment. Cleo was a bitter man who criticized her constantly, and within months he threw her out. Elizabeth drifted to Santa Barbara, where she found work at a military base post-exchange. She dated several soldiers, including a pilot named Matt Gordon, whom she claimed to be engaged to before he was killed in action in 1945. Elizabeth was constructing a narrative about her life, making it more romantic and tragic. In 1946, she returned to Los Angeles to try her luck in Hollywood. She moved from rooming house to hotel, restless and searching. She worked briefly as a waitress and dated many men to survive. The newspapers would later paint her as a prostitute, but there was no evidence of that. She was simply a young woman with no support trying to navigate a difficult city. On January 9, 1947, a salesman named Robert Red Manley drove Elizabeth back to Los Angeles from San Diego. He dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel around 6:03 p.m. It was the last time anyone reliably saw Elizabeth Short alive. 6 days later, her body was found in a vacant lot. What happened in those 6 days remains a mystery that has never been solved. Part 3. The crime scene. What happened to Elizabeth Short's body was so extreme and methodical that it seemed theatrical. The killer hadn't just murdered her, they staged her. The body lay just a few feet from the sidewalk on South Norton Avenue. It had been severed completely at the waist with such surgical precision that investigators immediately suspected the killer had medical training. Her face had been mutilated with deep cuts, extending from the corners of her mouth toward her ears, a Glasgow smile. The medical examiner's report confirmed that Elizabeth had been alive during at least some of the torture. The cause of death was cerebral hemorrhage from repeated blows to the head, combined with shock and blood lost to the head. The crime scene yielded almost nothing. The lot had been contaminated by reporters and onlookers almost as soon as the police arrived. The press coverage of the Black Dahlia case would become infamous. A reporter from the Examiner called Elizabeth's mother, lying that Elizabeth had won a beauty contest just to extract biographical details before telling her that her daughter had been murdered. The newspapers printed gruesome details and called her the Black Dahlia. On January 24th, the killer finally made contact. Part 4. The Hunt. The investigation became the largest manhunt in Los Angeles history. The first suspect was Robert Red Manley, but he had a solid alibi and was eventually released. However, the experience shattered his mental health. Thousands of tips poured in, and the police investigated everyone Elizabeth had known, including nightclub owner Mark Hansen. On January 24th, a package arrived at the Los Angeles Examiner containing Elizabeth's personal effects, including her birth certificate and Mark Hansen's address book. The killer had used cut-out letters from newspaper headlines for the address. More letters followed, each one a taunt. More than 60 people eventually confessed to the murder, but most were attention seekers or disturbed individuals. Investigators looked at similar crimes, such as the murder of Jean French and the Cleveland Torso murders, but no definitive links were found. By the summer of 1947, the investigation had stalled. In 1949, a grand jury noted that media interference had significantly hampered the investigation. Elizabeth Short would remain a ghost haunting Los Angeles for decades to come. Part 5. The Theories. In the decades since her death, dozens of people have claimed to know who killed Elizabeth Short. The most persistent theory centers on Dr. George Hodel, a brilliant but troubled physician. In 1949, Hodel was acquitted of sexually assaulting his daughter, but the LAPD suspected him of multiple murders. A wiretap in his home captured him saying, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia." They couldn't prove it now. After Hodel died, his son Steve, an LAPD detective, became convinced of his father's guilt and published Black Dahlia Avenger. Other suspects include Mark Hansen and Leslie Dillon. Some theories even suggest a conspiracy involving the Los Angeles Times publisher or organized crime figures. FBI profiler John Douglas concluded the killer was likely a local male with medical training who knew Elizabeth personally. The truth is that we will probably never know for certain. Too much time has passed and the evidence is gone. We have turned Elizabeth Short into a myth and a brand. But beneath the Black Dahlia was a real woman who deserved justice she never received. The vacant lot where Elizabeth Short's body was found is gone now. A house stands there today. Los Angeles has changed, and the corrupt LAPD of that era has been reformed. But the Black Dahlia case remains officially unsolved. We'll probably never know who killed her, and the killer likely died without ever facing consequences. Elizabeth Short was only 22 years old. She had a mother who loved her and dreams of being valued. She is buried in Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, California, where her gravestone simply reads, "Daughter, Elizabeth Short." She deserved to be remembered as a person, not just a mystery. If this video helped you see the woman beneath the myth, subscribe to Late Mysteries. We illuminate the dark corners of history and the stories that live beneath the ones we tell ourselves. Until next time, keep the candle lit.